What if I told you the most feared car in Australian racing wasn't a Holden and it wasn't a Ford? In the early 90s, a Japanese machine showed up, crushed the competition, and rewrote the rules of motorsport down under. That car was the Nissan Skyline GT-R R32, the Aussie V8-Killer. But here's the twist. How did a car built for Japanese streets become the unstoppable force that turned Australia's V8 racing world upside down? Stick around because the story only gets wilder from here. To understand why the GT-R R32 hit so hard, you first have to understand the world it crashed into. Australia in the 1980s and early 90s was a kingdom ruled by big, burly V8s. The Holden Commodore and the Ford Falcon weren't just cars, they were cultural icons. Families didn't just buy them, they pledged allegiance. Entire suburbs were split red versus blue, Holden versus Ford, and nowhere was that rivalry louder than at Bathurst. Mount Panorama wasn't just a racetrack, it was holy ground. The mountain echoed with the thunder of V8 engines, the roar of crowds, and the drama of bumper-to-bumper racing. Australian Touring Car Championship, the top tier of the sport, was built around these machines. The rules favored large displacement engines, rear-wheel drive, and the kind of brute force that rewarded raw power as much as precision. It was a gladiatorial contest. The Commodores and Falcons went door to door, lap after lap, and in doing so, they built legends. It was the kind of motorsport that made heroes out of drivers and turned cars into family heirlooms. For years, the script never changed. Holden versus Ford, power versus power, noise versus noise. But far from the mountain, a quiet revolution was happening. Japan was in the middle of its golden era of performance cars. Toyota had unleashed the Supra. Mazda had the nimble RX-7, and Nissan was working on something that didn't just aim to compete, it aimed to conquer. In 1989, the R32 Skyline GT-R rolled out of Japan like a machine from the future. It was bristling with technology, armed with all-wheel drive, four-wheel steering, and a twin-turbo engine that was as clever as it was powerful. It wasn't just another sports car, it was a technological powerhouse engineered specifically to dominate Group A touring car racing. When it finally landed in Australia in 1990, fans didn't know what to make of it. It looked different, it sounded different, and it raced different. To the faithful Holden and Ford supporters, it was an outsider. To the drivers who got behind the wheel, it was a weapon. And before long, it earned a new nickname, one that summed up its unstoppable nature: Godzilla. So what made the R32 GT-R so deadly? At first glance, its specs didn't look like anything that should terrify a field of thunderous Aussie V8s. It didn't have a massive 5-liter block under the hood. Instead, it carried a relatively small 2.6-liter inline-6 engine, tiny by Australian standards, where no replacement for displacement was practically a religion. But this wasn't just any six-cylinder. This was the RB26DETT, a twin-turbocharged masterpiece built to do one thing: win. In its standard street form, the GT-R officially made around 280 horsepower. That figure alone was respectable, but it only told half the story. Nissan deliberately underrated it because, with a few tweaks on the track, the RB26 could unleash much more. Race-prepped versions were comfortably producing well over 500 horsepower, and some teams even pushed beyond 600. All from a 2.6-liter engine. For V8 loyalists, it was almost an insult. How could something so small, so unassuming, generate that kind of firepower? But raw power wasn't the Skyline's only trick. The real magic came from its technology. The GT-R came armed with etched ETS, an advanced all-wheel drive system that could constantly monitor grip and send power to whichever wheels needed it most. On tight, twisty circuits where Falcons and Commodores were wrestling to put their torque down, the Skyline simply gripped and fired out of corners with surgical precision. Then there was the super high-cast four-wheel steering system. At higher speeds, it could subtly adjust the rear wheels to help the car corner flatter, sharper, and faster. To rivals used to old-school muscle, it looked like sorcery. Suddenly, this wasn't just a car, it was a computer-controlled weapon. Where the V8s brawled their way up Mount Panorama, the Skyline danced with a kind of elegance that fans had never seen before. To Aussie crowds used to raw, bellowing engines, it felt like cheating. But for the drivers lucky enough to sit behind the wheel, it felt like heaven. It wasn't just a car you drove, it was a car that made you feel invincible. Ask any driver lucky enough to pilot the R32 GT-R in its prime, and you'll hear the same thing. The car made them feel untouchable. Jim Richards and Mark Skaife, two icons of Australian motorsport, didn't just drive the Skyline, they turned it into a weapon of legend. Their partnership with the GT-R delivered back-to-back victories that stamped its name into the record books. Richards himself once called it the best touring car I've ever driven. And coming from a man who raced everything from muscle cars to Porsches, that wasn't casual praise, it was gospel. What made racers fall in love with it wasn't just the speed. Though the speed was outrageous, it was the confidence. The car's advanced all-wheel drive gave drivers the ability to attack corners harder than they ever thought possible. They could brake later, push deeper into the apex, and rocket out earlier without fear of spinning up the tires. It wasn't just faster, it was forgiving. Where a Commodore or Falcon might snap back if you overstepped the line, the GT-R felt like it had your back, rewarding aggression instead of punishing it. Nowhere was that more obvious than at Bathurst. In 1991, Skaife and Richards delivered a performance that bordered on humiliation for the competition. The GT-R didn't just win, it obliterated the field, finishing 6 laps clear of the nearest rival. 6 laps at Mount Panorama isn't a victory, it's an exclamation mark. And then came 1992, the infamous wet race. Rain lashed down on the mountain, turning the track into an ice rink for the V8s. But the Skyline, with its all-wheel drive, carved through the chaos like it was born for those conditions. While others fought just to stay pointed in the right direction, the GT-R surged ahead to claim back-to-back glory. For drivers, it was a dream. For fans of Ford and Holden, it was a nightmare. But one thing was undeniable. Racers loved the GT-R because it didn't just win races, it made them feel like legends. Sitting behind the wheel, you weren't just driving a car, you were piloting the future of motorsport. But no car is perfect, and the R32 Skyline GT-R's dominance also sowed the seeds of its downfall. The first flaw wasn't in the car itself, it was in perception. Fans hated it. They saw the Nissan as an intruder that ruined the sacred Ford versus Holden battle. Crowds would boo when it crossed the line, and headlines screamed about the death of Aussie racing tradition. The second flaw was political. The car's success forced rulemakers to rethink everything. The Skyline had simply outgrown Group A regulations, and by 1993, the governing body decided enough was enough. New rules came in, designed to bring the focus back to homegrown V8s. The GT-R was essentially legislated out of the series. Then there was the cost. Running a GT-R wasn't cheap. Its advanced technology demanded serious money to maintain and tune, which made it harder for smaller teams to compete on a level playing field. While Holden and Ford could field multiple cars with relative ease, the Skyline was always a bit of an exclusive machine. And let's not forget weight. The GT-R was heavier than the V8s, and on certain tracks, that bulk could be a disadvantage. It wasn't unbeatable in every situation, but when the conditions suited, it was untouchable. Despite all the controversy, the GT-R R32's legacy is absolutely undeniable. It forced Australian motorsport to change. Up until its arrival, raw horsepower and displacement had ruled the mountain. But the Skyline proved that brains could beat brawn, that advanced engineering could outshine old-school muscle. Even though the rulemakers eventually pushed it out of the championship, the impact it left behind was permanent. For Nissan fans, the car wasn't just a fast import, it was a hero. Its back-to-back Bathurst victories cemented it as one of the greatest touring cars of all time. Even today, the footage of Mark Skaife and Jim Richards sending the GT-R over the top of Mount Panorama still gives goosebumps. It's replayed in highlight reels, not just as a win, but as a turning point in racing history. And then there was the unforgettable 1992 moment. After winning Bathurst in heavy rain and being showered with boos from a crowd furious at the GT-R's dominance, Jim Richards stepped up to the podium. What came out of his mouth was raw, emotional, and unfiltered. "This is a pack of arseholes." In that instant, Richards didn't just defend the car, he immortalized it. That speech, as much as the victories themselves, etched the Skyline into Australian folklore. Globally, the R32 earned the nickname Godzilla not just in Australia, but across the racing world. It dominated in Japan, it conquered in Europe, and its reputation spread everywhere motorsport was taken seriously. Today, clean examples fetch staggering prices. And whenever an RB26DETT engine spools up, enthusiasts instantly recognize the sound. And perhaps its greatest legacy is that it didn't die with the R32. It paved the way for the R33, the R34, and eventually the modern R35 GT-R. Every time you see one of those cars today, you're looking at a direct descendant of the monster that once terrorized Mount Panorama. So, was the Nissan Skyline GT-R R32 really the Aussie V8 killer? Absolutely. It didn't just win races, it forced an entire country to rethink what racing could be. Loved by racers, hated by purists, but respected by everyone who witnessed its power? Godzilla left a mark that will never fade. Was banning the GT-R the right call, or did Australia miss out on seeing how far this monster could really go? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this debate is still alive today. And if you enjoyed diving into the story of the V8 killer, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into racing legends, and share this with someone who loves motorsport as much as you do. Because stories like this aren't just about cars, they're about eras, rivalries, and the machines that dared to change the game.